So the refugee crisis is a typical example of capitalism's long-standing tendency to create humanitarian catastrophes and then to leave the victims of these catastrophes to fend for themselves. The millions of refugees who have to leave their countries and look for safety and a better life in Europe and elsewhere are trying to escape war and the general immiseration that results from the economic and geopolitical competition that is central to contemporary world capitalism. Many of these refugees come from Syria, others come from Afghanistan, and yet others from other war-torn parts of Asia and Africa. Many of these countries have become chaotic as a result of military and other kinds of intervention by Western powers and the US. So the chaos cannot be simply attributed to non-Western so-called barbarians, such as ISIS, or to dictators like Assad who go against the West's supposedly democratic norms. Although actors such as ISIS and Assad are certainly dangerous, they are not antithetical to global capitalism, but in many ways the products of this system. So ISIS, for example, was able to control much of the territory in Iraq and Syria as a result of the US invasion of Iraq. And it has similarly benefited from the chaotic situation in Libya, again as a result of the US and European military intervention in that country. And of course it was able to grow to its present size and strength thanks to support from long-standing US allies such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So all of these factors that have contributed to the current mess express the attempt to control economically and geopolitically important areas of the world, such as the Middle East, and to minimize the influence of powers such as Russia and Iran that in various ways pose a threat to the continued world hegemony of the US and the West. This hegemony had already suffered as a result of the ongoing global economic crisis, as well as by the Arab Spring. So, in other words, the refugee crisis is the latest reminder of the human toll that the operation of global capitalism and the economic and political elites within it routinely produce. It's not just that millions of people have been displaced by Syria and other countries after having been bombed or after seeing their neighbors brutally murdered by the various parties of its conflict. Even after they leave the original countries, as we just heard, they often find themselves subjected to exploitation by traffickers and repression or rejection by governments in Europe and elsewhere. In the case of Europe, for example, all kinds of dubious devices are used to keep refugees out. Walls and fences are built up, rubber bullets and tear gas are used to defend the borders from those fleeing the records produced partly through the contribution of the supposedly civilized West. Moreover, dubious distinctions are made between refugees and economic immigrants. According to the twisted logic of European elites, if your life is threatened by war, you have to claim to the characterization of refugee and to the legal rights that this characterization entails. But if your life is threatened by the poverty, misery, and economic exploitation that global capitalism routinely generates, you're merely an immigrant who has to be detained and deported back to where you came from. Beyond that, of course, even this problematic distinction between refugees and economic immigrants is applied in an arbitrary fashion so as to disqualify large numbers of people coming from countries such as Afghanistan that are still faced with war. So while the racism of the European policy on the refugees becomes clear every day, there are, of course, social forces within Europe that have shown solidarity towards the refugees and have criticized the way refugees are being treated by European governments. It is worth pointing out, however, that even some of the criticism against European policies is couched in ideological terms that obscure the issues. So we're told, for example, that the current European policies towards refugees go against European ideals. I mean, this way of thinking idealizes Europe so as to argue that despite all the appearances to the contrary, the so-called European project is not a source of exploitation and oppression of Europeans and non-Europeans alike, but a force that by definition leads to democracy and social justice. In other words, when the European project proves to be brutal and oppressive, it's because it's not really European. In reality, of course, the European project has been used to erase the social and economic gains of European workers and ordinary people that were achieved in the post-World War II period, and to impose brutal austerity policies that have led to skyrocketing unemployment rates and poverty rates, both in the European North and especially in the European South. Moreover, the economic polarization that has been produced by the neoliberal policies on the basis of the European project have combined with a racism that never ceased to be a part of the European civilization to produce the ghettos in many European cities that create conditions which lead to the kind of spectacular terrorist attacks in Brussels, Paris, and elsewhere that we have observed in recent years. And although these attacks have usually been planned and executed by European citizens, they are being used to justify Europe's racist determination to keep refugees out. It is ironic, of course, that Europe would in the long run stand to gain from an inflow of refugees and immigrants. Indeed, many European countries are in a state of demographic decline, which has, of course, been exacerbated by the neoliberal attacks on family support policies and the European welfare state. Sectors of the European and economic and political elites, of course, recognize this problem. So Germany's initial openness towards refugees, which encouraged the growth of refugee flows since the last summer, was partly motivated by the needs of German industrial capital. After all, as we know even from American history, the demand for cheap labor has long been one of the factors behind open-door immigration policies that are periodically adopted by capitalist countries. But American history also teaches us that these phases of open-door immigration policy eventually create the conditions for xenophobic and racist backlashes, which is precisely what seems to be taking place in Europe right now. And as you may know, today there is a presidential election in Austria, and it looks like the far-right candidate may actually be the next president of Austria, and he has made the refugee issue a big part of his platform. So after creating monsters like ISIS outside Europe, the contradictions of global capitalism are creating other kinds of monsters within Europe, not just the terrorist groups that are ready to indiscriminately hit in subways, theaters, and airports, but also the rapidly growing influence of racist, fascist, and neo-Nazi groups on the policies adopted by the more respectable political forces holding power in Europe. And that's important to emphasize because the rise of the far right is not just a matter of gaining a higher percentage in elections or even or occasionally even as I was just mentioning, winning the presidency, but it's like the effect they're actually having on the policies that are adopted by the parties in power. And that effect is in some ways even more important practically than the specific percentages they get in elections. What all this means practically is that all these problems will never be addressed by scapegoating immigrants, but by uniting them with them to fight against the capitalist system that plagues both our existence and theirs. And this is important to stress at the time when growing numbers of people in the US and elsewhere are becoming disaffected by the effects of growing economic inequalities on themselves and their families. And this is also important to stress in view of the fact that the number of refugees in the future is likely to increase dramatically as a result of climate change and the ecological havoc that capitalism is wreaking on the planet. Without a clear recognition of what lies at the root of people's discontent, this discontent would likely be channeled by reactionary far-right forces such as the fascists in Europe and the likes of Trump in the US. If that were to happen, the claim of Western societies to be democratic and civilized would become even more untenable than it already is. And the losers in such a scenario would be not just refugees and immigrants, but the vast majority of people living in Western societies and in these societies' proverbial backyards. Thank you.